July 7, 1944. Northern Saipan, 4:45 in the morning. Corporal James Whelan, a Marine artillery observer, scratched urgent coordinates onto damp paper. Through his field glasses, he saw something that should not exist in modern warfare. Thousands of Japanese soldiers, bayonets fixed, officers waving swords, even the walking wounded limping forward. What he was witnessing was the beginning of the largest Banzai charge of the Pacific War. He picked up his radio and called in a fire mission. Grid 164, 223. Estimated 4,000 enemy. This is not a probe. Request all available batteries. What the Japanese soldiers didn't realize was that they were marching into the deadliest fire control system ever used in combat. American artillery, 105mm howitzers, 155 long toms, mortars, even naval guns from offshore battleships were all linked together by a system of radios, plotting boards, and mathematical precision. Within 60 seconds, the Americans could concentrate. More firepower on a single map grid than entire armies had managed in the First World War. The Japanese doctrine of gyokusai, to shatter like a jewel in honorable death, was about to collide with industrial firepower. The Japanese had used Banzai charges before. At Guadalcanal in 1942, nearly 1,000 men had rushed Marine lines at Alligator Creek, only to be slaughtered by pre-registered American artillery. By Tarawa in 1943, the Americans had refined their system further, learning to coordinate multiple battalions so that shells landed simultaneously, what they called time on target. But Japanese commanders refused to adapt. They believed spirit could overcome firepower. By early July 1944, the Japanese on Saipan were trapped. General Yoshitsugu Saito commanded what was left of his army, once 32,000 strong, now reduced to a few thousand. Surrounded on three sides with the ocean at their backs, he gave his final order. Whether we attack or stay, there is only death. We must show true Japanese manhood. His soldiers, sailors, mechanics, and even civilians were assembled for one last charge. The wounded were given grenades and told to kill themselves after the Americans passed. Women and teenagers carried bamboo spears. It would be death on a massive scale. The Americans, however, were ready. Every Marine and Army battalion had forward observers with radios. Every artillery battery had its guns pre-registered on numbered grid squares. Communications ran through redundant lines. Radio, wire, even runners. Colonel Louis Meeser of the 10th Marines had spent weeks perfecting the fire plan. When an observer called a grid, every battery already knew the range. The system was so precise that dozens of batteries could fire from different locations and have their shells land at the exact same second. At 4:45 a.m., over 4,000 Japanese soldiers surged forward across the Tanapag Plain. They filled the night with their cries of "Banzai! Banzai!" echoing against the valley walls. It was a sight both terrifying and unreal. Wounded men on crutches hobbling forward. Naval mechanics who barely knew how to hold rifles. Civilians driven ahead by soldiers. The sound carried to American lines, where forward observers calmly spoke into radios. Grid 164-2223. Regiment Strength Force. Request immediate suppression. The reply came instantly. Time on target. Splash in 90 seconds. And then the sky erupted. At 4:47, shells from 12 artillery battalions and naval guns began raining down. Hundreds of explosions struck at once, tearing into the densely packed wave of men. In the first hour, American artillery fired more than 2,600 rounds. Forward observers adjusted constantly. Drop 200, left 100, repeat. Walking the barrage back and forth across the valley like a giant scythe. Ravines where survivors tried to take cover were hit with airbursts. The Japanese kept coming, but each step forward cost them hundreds of lives. By sunrise, some groups of Japanese soldiers had reached the American front lines. The 105th Infantry Regiment bore the brunt, suffering nearly 80% casualties as the Japanese pushed into their positions. Artillery crews themselves fought hand-to-hand when attackers reached their guns. Some howitzer crews depressed their barrels and fired point-blank at charging enemies. Naval gunfire joined in. The battleship USS Tennessee alone fired nearly 300 rounds from its 14-inch guns. By 7:30, the grand charge had broken down into scattered groups of desperate men rushing forward in small clusters, shouting, "Banzai!" Before being cut down, amid the chaos, acts of extraordinary bravery stood out. Lieutenant Colonel William O'Brien refused evacuation after being wounded, manning a jeep-mounted machine gun until he was killed, surrounded by dozens of enemy dead. Private Thomas Baker fought until he was too wounded to walk. Propped against a tree, pistol in hand, he chose to stay behind and cover his comrades. His body was later found with 8 Japanese soldiers around him. Captain Benjamin Salomon, a dentist serving as battalion surgeon, picked up a machine gun to defend his aid station, killing nearly 100 attackers before being cut down. All 3 would receive the Medal of Honor. By 10 a.m., it was over. The valley was carpeted with bodies. Over 4,300 Japanese were killed in just a few hours. American casualties were around 1,000. Heavy, but nothing compared to the annihilation suffered by the attackers. Survivors hid in caves, but organized resistance on Saipan had ended. General Saito committed suicide days later. The Japanese High Command would call it honorable sacrifice. In reality, it was mass suicide against overwhelming firepower. The Banzai charge at Saipan marked the end of an era in warfare. The samurai tradition of courage and spiritual strength had collided with the mathematics of modern artillery and lost. The American system of fire direction centers, time-on-target missions, and coordinated communications turned artillery into a science. Courage alone could not overcome it. Veterans who survived the battle remembered it with horror. One recalled, "We didn't want to kill them all, but they kept coming. Our artillery just cut them down. It was horrible, but what choice did we have?" The destruction of the Saipan Banzai charge was more than a battle. It was a turning point in the history of war. Never again would massed infantry charges be seen as viable against modern firepower. Technology, organization, and coordination had become the true weapons of war. On that July morning in 1944, courage met mathematics, spirit met science, and tradition met technology. Technology won.